Hey, what's up, everybody? Today I want to do a short little video on a subject I really enjoy. Between the holidays and SHOT Show coming up, I don't have a ton of spare time, so doing a video on something I really love is kind of just really easy to do. And today we're going to look at the difference between two retro fighting shotguns. Trench guns and riot guns. What's the difference? What were they used for? How are they used? And why are they set up the way they're set up? Now, they do have a lot in common. Both are obviously retro fighting guns. Both use shorter barrels, and historically, both are pump action repeating shotguns. And they do differ slightly, but the differences are kind of big. So let's start with the riot gun. Historically, it was the first of the two, so it makes for a great starting place. So the exact origin of the term is unknown, but the earliest example of we have of a gun being called a riot gun goes back to a newspaper from Indiana called the Logan Sport Daily, which describes a short shotgun used for controlling rioters as a riot gun. Now, this newspaper was published in 1886, but it's likely the term predates that. We just don't have any written evidence other than that. In reality, if the term was used in 1886, it probably predates the pump action shotgun, or at least the riot gun that was described is unlikely to have been a pump action shotgun. The term really became part of the cultural zeitgeist with pump action shotguns. Riot guns are short barreled guns with barrel length typically between 18 to 20 inches, and they were never all that different than a sporting shotgun. Basically, you lop off 10 inches of barrel, and that's about it, and it's no longer a sporting shotgun. They do tend to use cylinder bores, and there was never a need for a magazine plug, so they held 4 or 5 rounds depending on the gun. Wood furniture was also the norm at the time because, we had the plastic fantastic explosion. Now, a very early example of a major company using the term comes from Winchester. And in 1898, they made riot gun versions of the 1897 shotgun. Now, there was a very limited numbers of the original pump action 1893 in a riot configuration, according to the World's Fighting Shotguns by Thomas Swearingen. However, these weren't marked riots or advertised as riot guns. It seems like about 650 of them existed, though. So riot guns kind of became the norm for like a police shotgun. That's just what they were called. The Remington Model 10 had a riot gun model. So did the Winchester Model 12, and the Stevens 520 620 series also had riot gun configurations. So why were these guns called riot guns? Now the obvious answer is that they were used during riots. And the obvious answer makes sense, but I really like digging into the why. So why were shotguns used as riot guns? They weren't gunning down rioters in the streets with buckshot. So what advantage did the shotgun offer over a rifle of the era? It's kind of critical we set the stage and understand what riots were like back in the 1900, back in 1900, back in 1910, 1920, 1930, and understand they were a lot more violent than the riots we see today. We've all seen riots. We've seen cities burn down. We've seen a lot of devastation. But to kind of put this into perspective, the riots of yesteryear, like dozens of deaths were common, hundreds of injuries, and people clashed in the street like in all-out brawls. I mean, it was a lot more intense than what we had today, and a lot more dangerous. So the intensity required something a little more than your normal police officer 38 revolver. There's also prison riots, which were a lot tougher to manage in this era. If a prison riot happens now, you call in the National Guard. They're there in an hour, and it's dispersed. Back in the day, they had a lot less backup, a lot slower response, and very low tech prisons, which were tough to shut down. A big reason why shotguns have been so popular for riot control and so popular for police use is that they can shoot a variety of munitions. Police weren't shooting buckshot into a crowd and killing people to stop riots. It kind of seems counterintuitive. Instead, what they could do is use smaller sized birdshot. Now, it seems insane to our modern ears, but birdshot was considered a somewhat less lethal option due to its small size. And if employed at like a decent range, beyond 20 yards, it's less likely to do permanent damage. That being said, it wasn't a non-lethal option, and it definitely would still poke your eye out. Rock salt might have been something. I don't know if that was ever used, but I see a lot of references to rock salt for a non-lethal round back in the early 20th century. I can't find anything official on that, but it is an interesting idea. A riot gun, and you had birdshot. One thing you could do was employ something called skipping shot. If an officer fired a load of birdshot at an angle against the ground, it skips upwards and into the rioters, often into the lower body, lower extremities. So whenever you do this, the spread is actually quite wide, and it loses a lot of velocity. So if you're bouncing small birdshot into rioters at range, and it's losing a lot of velocity, you're a lot less likely to permanently harm them. Still, there's a chance, just less likely. Now, I did some skipping shot to see how effective it was, and I was shocked at the first shot that it worked. Like, you could really get into skipping shot, bird shot, buckshot, probably more. Even against soft sand of my range, it worked actually really, really well. If you guys are interested, I'll do an entire video on skipping shot, but I don't want to get too hung up on it here. A friend of mine who was in corrections before he entered, became a beat cop, and he mentioned when I talked to him about this that skipping shot is still used with less lethal munitions for prison riots with wood baton rounds from shotguns. So it's still a tactic used today, just not with birdshot. The variety of munitions and the ability to skip shot made shotguns a better riot control alternative to rifles, handguns, and batons. They had the ability to be a little less lethal, and shotguns were also kind of short and light compared to military rifles of the era, also fairly cheap because shotguns were so simple. And, the 12 gauge bore is certainly an intimidating weapon to face down. It's not one people look at and say, oh, I'll charge that guy. Shotguns are still used for riots. It's still used in prisons to help control inmates with less lethal munitions. But people don't really call them riot guns anymore. We do have a wide variety of less lethal munitions available these days. Beanbags, batons, wood rounds, some I'm likely missing. It's also worth mentioning the term riot gun is now also used to describe 37 and 40 millimeter launchers, which do have a much more capable set of munitions, and they're kind of replacing shotguns as the non-lethal alternative, or less lethal alternative. So that's riot guns. So now let's talk about trench guns. Now it's fair to say that the trench gun was an evolution of the riot gun, the riot shotgun. Like the riot gun, they were sporting guns with a lopped-off barrel. However, the trench gun kind of features a very distinct feature set. The most obvious difference and most important is the presence of a heat shield and bayonet. So the trench guns were designed for World War I. The bloody trench warfare and the brutal close-quarters combat called for a more capable weapon than the soldier's normal full-size fighting rifle. Once troops dived into trenches, the fighting would often devolve into brutal close-quarters combat. It became so prevalent that troops were making their own fighting weapons. It became really like medieval. Maces, clubs, knives, spears. The rifles were just a little less effective due to their size and weight. Europeans fought each other with the long, full-powered bolt-action rifles of the era, and those were not optimized for the close-quarters fighting in the trenches. When the Americans decided to get involved into the European bloodbath that was World War I, they saw an optimized solution to trench warfare, and it was the trench gun. So shotguns with short barrels are optimized for close-quarters combat. So at close range, shotguns are very brutal and very decisive weapons. You hit someone in the torso with a load of buckshot, and you're putting 9 approximate 33 caliber pellets in them. It tends to dissuade them from fighting much longer. Pump action shotguns were also faster to fire than bolt action rifles. A soldier could leap into a trench and just sweep it left to right with their shotgun while throwing, someone throws grenades, and they could establish that foothold to continue their assault. So the trench guns with their bayonets and heat shields were kind of an important mix. Now, heat shields were absolutely necessary for the user to fight with the bayonet. If you're using a bayonet on a shotgun, your hand wraps around the barrel and the pump, and you could do America's finest martial art, the thrust and slash. Heat shield protected the hand because shotgun barrels get pretty damn hot pretty fast. With a fighting rifle of the era, they had those big wooden handguards that went the whole length of the barrel. Shotguns didn't really have that. Well, I paused because the Remington Model 10 did use a wooden rifle-like handguard on their trench gun. But the most common and the most prevalent was the Winchester 1897 with that kind of wire mesh heat shield. And Winchester actually had a patent on that. Winchester was a gun company, kind of. They were a patent company that just happened to make guns. Because they had a patent on the metal heat shield, most other companies employed wooden handguards to avoid a lawsuit from Winchester. It's kind of a funny thing about Winchester and their patents. Let's talk about Slamfire. There's a lot of hoopla spread around the world about Slamfire in World War I and its effectiveness and how it would, sweep a trench from left to right with a shotgun and slamfiring it. You'll hear people brag, "Oh, my Ithaca 37 can slamfire." Slamfire's dumb. Did some GIs use it in the trenches? There's probably some 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds that thought it was fun. I thought firing an M240 from my hip was fun, but it doesn't mean it's an effective combat tactic. So what Slamfire is, if you're not sure, I guess I'm getting on a tangent here, is that Slamfire in a pump shotgun allows you to fire the gun just by holding down the trigger and closing the action. Every time the action closes, the gun will fire until it's empty. Now, it sounds cool, and it kind of sounds like you can fire faster. However, if you've ever actually tried it, it's just kind of dumb. So it's you can't get the same recoil mitigation, accuracy, or control over the gun. So it kind of could easily get away from you, especially the kind of small furnitured shotguns of the era. It's about as effective as bump firing an AR from your hip. If you look into like military manuals at the time, which are easy to find, Slamfire isn't mentioned in any of the shotgun manuals. So I don't believe it was an official tactic. Did 18-year-old GI do it? Sure, but it doesn't mean it worked. It's it's faster to shoot the gun with a push pull with a standard grip and stance than it is to slam fire it. Trench guns were kind of the de facto military fighting shotgun for a few decades. They lasted through both world wars, Korea, and even up into Vietnam. Now it's kind of around Vietnam that the trench gun kind of started to fade away. The need for bayonets and heat shield kind of lessened, and shotguns became more specialized weapons. By Vietnam, plenty of shotguns like the Ithaca 37s and the 870s ditched them. There was trench Ithacas, to be clear, but you wouldn't likely find them after Vietnam, after the early days. But the last trench gun was the Winchester Model 1200 that was employed in the early 80s, and it did have the traditional heat shield and bayonet lug. Very, very limited numbers of these, and they don't get talked about often. Kind of appropriate that Winchester had the first trench gun, that they also get to have the last. Had the best, if you ask me, with the Model 12. The Model 1897 is cool, Model 12 is cooler. Riots and trenches were just two niche combat arenas shotguns excelled in. As wars changed, the shotgun became less relevant, but it's still useful. From breaching doors to killing drones, the shotgun keeps coming up with new ways to stay relevant. As mentioned, they're still used as a riot gun these days, albeit in a much safer way. Now, with that said, if we dive into the Ukraine conflict, maybe we'll need trench guns again. It seems like that fight has a lot of trenches, but I doubt it. Um, so much like Stephen King, I kind of suck at ending these things. So if you've watched this far, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the content I'm throwing out there. I will be at SHOT Show. If you guys want to comment below anything you guys want me to cover, I don't think I'll be doing a lot of videos from SHOT Show, but I will at least probably put out maybe like a top 5 things I like or I'm looking forward to. Anyway, you guys have a great day.